On tonight's show, we're talking beautiful code with guest Bob Nisko and his beautiful beard. You're not going to want to miss this. Stay tuned. This is Change Mode, episode number 5, recorded June 25th, 2014. 7 unbelievable code beauty tips. Alright, welcome to the Change Mode show, episode number 5. This is going to be the most beautiful show we've ever done. And there are 2 reasons for that. One is because we have a special guest, Bob Nisko, who's here and is a beautiful person. Hello, Bob.
Hey.
How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Great. Bob is fun employed at the moment, but will be working at Microsoft at some point in the summer. And, of course, Colby's with me as always. How's it going, Colby?
Pretty sweet. I just had pizza.
Also that's perfect. The second reason this podcast will be beautiful is because we'll be talking about beautiful code, which is going to be great. I'd like to remind you all to go to coffeeandbeer.tv to check out all the other great coffeeandbeer.tv shows, including last night's epically delayed and epically executed Don't Panic. Yeah, I heard it was good. I wasn't there, though, so if you don't like me, watch that episode.
That guy sucks.
Yeah, he really
Just
does.
kidding.
All right, let's talk about beautiful code. So this was inspired by a presentation that none of us saw Bob give, but we saw the slides. So that's
right.
That's close, right? That's close.
That is close. I wish you guys were there for it. You could have Skyped in, but that's all right.
Missed opportunity.
I think this is better, though. This will be better. We can discuss it all, and it'll be much better.
Cool. What is beautiful code? Definitions first.
Sure.
And maybe even what is beauty? That might.
Whoa! Now we're going to get
God.
philosophic already.
Computer
I
science
think
and philosophy are you can't disentangle them.
Very true. Very true. Beautiful code. I kind of got inspiration for this talk because I was working on a project over the winter break with just a friend of mine. He's West Coast based. I'm East Coast based. And it was a Rails project. And I had never written Rails or Ruby. And he was doing all this stuff, all this Ruby-esque things. And I was like, this looks really cool, but I don't know what any of it means. And then so I started doing my own. I learned a little bit more about it. And I was writing what I thought was nice code. But he kind of came to me and was like, hey, there's a Rails way to do it. There's a Ruby way to do it. You're forcing a wrong style onto this language. And so I was applying that backwards to other sort of languages I've worked in. And I realized beautiful code, there's kind of a certain amount of rules, which I line out in 7 bullet points in this presentation. I'm not going to say that these are the only rules, but we can go through those 7 bullet points. And I think that's what defines beautiful code.
All right. So why don't we start like all good stories, start at the beginning. Point number one in your presentation, clean code matters.
Clean code matters, that's right.
A self-fulfilling prophecy.
You would think that, right? Also, just for the viewers, before we jump in, this talk was at my college, kind of geared more towards first and second year college students. So some of this stuff might seem like a little bit basic, like this first bullet point, as you guys can see. But the point is that clean code matters, and that for someone who has never programmed before, you can have this really ugly code, as you can see on this first slide, where your parentheses aren't lined up, your braces are all off, you have tabs and spaces mixed, and they're indented all crazy. But you could say to yourself, well, it works, yeah, but it's not clean at all.
But you can't read it.
You can't read it, that's right. But, like I was saying, like if someone were to look at this who just start, they'd say, whatever, it works, what does it matter?
So that segues beautifully into rule number 2, which is the cardinal rule for source code. Code is read more often than it is written.
Correct.
Okay. That's an assertion.
Absolutely an assertion. I think the idea behind that one, I think, was taken from the PEP 8 guidelines from Python that talks about why their syntax is the way it is. And they say this is pretty much the cardinal rule, is that code is read more often than it's written. And I think it's important to make your code pretty, as the second slide of that states.
So how do we... actually, we'll get to that later. Sorry, I was about to jump ahead.
No, that's
But we
fine.
all agree that code is written more often than it is... read more often than it is written. I guess if it's greater than once, then you're meeting that rule.
That's true. I think, And I feel like the number of times it's read increases exponentially as you increase the number of developers working on the code, if that makes sense.
No, that does make sense. And also it would be read more often if it's written poorly. They'll have to read it multiple times to glean a meaning from it. So yes,
yeah,
also true.
Yeah, that's a fair point. So point number 3. Where were we? Talk about JavaScript a lot. Know the paradigms of your language.
Yeah,
this
the
is
example,
a hard one to do. Like
absolutely.
You just pointed out.
Absolutely a hard thing to do. I before I got to this point, I went through a quick JavaScript example where if JavaScript has optional semicolons, if you will, and it kind of inserts it where it thinks it would work if there's not a semicolon there. And the example is basically returning an object where the object open brace starts on the second line. So JavaScript would just return undefined. And the point is that in Java, if you were working in Java and you did that, that would be okay, or whatever language has object syntax like that. But JavaScript is a whole other beast, as we all know. And so the point is, before you kind of get into any language that you're going to write in, you really should do your research first, whether that's reading through other people's code or reading the kind of official guidelines.
Do most languages have... All right, we're going to get to this too. Gosh.
We're going to get to that too. It all flows together, you know?
Oh, my word. Oh, yeah, so do most languages have official guidelines?
That's funny, actually. Python is, to me, the quintessential example of a language that does have an official guideline. They have their PEP 8 paper that's always updated as they change versions and whatnot. But I remember I took a software development class, and one of the textbooks was a Java-style guide book written by someone who didn't work on Java. It was just a Javavore, if you will. So you're kind of thinking to yourself, well, then what guide do I follow? Because Oracle doesn't really put out an official guideline. I mean, what do you guys think about that? What other languages?
Well, Go is another. Sorry, Colby. You want to say it?
You did.
Yeah, no, you go for it.
No, you already started. You already started. All right, no, I'll say it. Last week, Dan and I wrote an impromptu chat client in Go to learn Go in like 3 days. But it turns out Go, the language, enforces its own style guide. Like, it has an incredibly strict format, and it throws errors if you break the format.
You use tabs instead of spaces. If you use 4 spaces instead of 2 spaces.
Yeah, it's like how you break up your lines and where the parentheses go and stuff. It's pretty strict. And it was like, as a beginner, it was kind of frustrating because I wanted to write my Go like I write my JavaScript, and I couldn't.
So your code wasn't beautiful by definition, then, I'm sorry to say.
Yes. Yeah. But
I don't think any of us have any delusions about that part right now. That code that we wrote last week is not by any standard.
I don't think that was the goal, though.
Yeah, I really like Go's approach to this. So Python really frustrates me. Because it's white space dependent, your white space breaks the compile. Whereas in Go, you can write it however you want, but you have to Go format it before you release it. You just run the Go format command, and it'll change all that stupid crap you did into the right way.
So it actually rewrites your source file?
Yeah.
Really? Okay.
You run Go format against a piece of Go source code, and it returns the Go formatted version, but you can just shovel that directly onto the file that you piped into it.
That's pretty cool, actually. I feel like there's an abundance of linting tools or IDEs that kind of help you write that, but I don't think I've ever heard of something that actually modifies your code like that.
Yeah. So I had a Vim plugin going that whenever I saved the buffer, it would just run Go format and instead save the Go format output and then read it back in.
That's a good idea.
It was great. I wish I had that for everything.
Yeah, so that was a good thing then in your eyes, right? Was that you knew that it fit the guidelines, you knew that it would work more or less,
Yeah, and I learned the guidelines way faster than just writing it however I wanted, then maybe submitting an open source pull request and then having whoever the maintainer is be like, oh, these 1,000 things you actually need to change.
Yeah. Did that Go format, or did it log your errors, or did it just blindly do it and you had to pick it out
I
manually.
think it just blindly did it.
Okay.
The compiler will tell you errors, but the formatter just goes. No pun intended.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think like I feel like the formatter is like half a linter, where it's like it won't correct errors, and it won't really point out errors either because you have the compiler for that. Whereas a linter is like half style enforcement and half like this is fucking broken enforcement. Like,
well, in my eyes, so what is a linter? Does anyone have a definition for that?
Don't off the top of my head.
But Google knows.
that it does.
Google tells me it's a machine for removing cotton fibers. Something tells me that's not right.
Well, it's kind of close. If cotton fiber is weird inconsistencies. So, in my brain, a linter is a thing that it's a programmatic way of enforcing a style guide, but a style guide isn't necessarily just syntactic. So, at work, we recently wrote a mustache style guide, and so one of the things is don't leave off .mustache when you include a partial. You can do it either way. Just pick a way and do it. Like the specification allows you to do both, but that's a pain if you want to grep for all instances of something. So just do it one way so you know that your string will always be the same everywhere. And we can lint for that. We can check substring on dot. If the right-hand side is not mustache, then throw an error. That's really easy. You can put that in a linter. A linter is also really good for keeping things out of a code base. I've used this a lot, that you don't want to go back in. So like if you go through and you do a massive refactor and you we shouldn't call time directly. I wrapped time in this object so that we could do the things we need to do with it. You can lint for other calls to time outside that file and throw an error when someone tries to use it. But that's not syntax. That's like a convention enforcer.
Right.
Right. That's true. Yeah, so at work we have lint errors for like CSS rules that people love to use that also tend to like destroy scroll perf, like box shadow. And there's also, I don't know. There's like boring ones that check for like every PHP file has to have like, Facebook, copyright Facebook at the top in a comment, and like that's annoying. So that, I think that one it'll actually insert it for you if you're lazy like me and don't want to write it.
You have to find the copyright Unicode symbol. That's just too much work.
Yes. Just ridiculous. But yeah, I think linters are certainly good tools to like keep yourself honest.
But that doesn't really have anything to do with beauty, I don't think.
I think it does. I think it go hand in hand.
Okay.
I think, as you were saying, you don't use time object directly and you have a wrapper around it. I think if everyone, because obviously you're working not just by yourself on this massive project, if everyone is using a standardized way of using and manipulating time, I think that could lead to a more beautiful source code and also more readable.
Yeah, I feel like that ties into one of your other rules. I don't remember what number it was, but it was like consistency is key.
Oh, that happens to be the very next rule, Colby.
No
yes.
way. Yeah, that is the next
well timed. Yeah, and I think like it really is key. It's a huge thing. Like if you want, especially if I don't know. Again, almost all of this stuff I think boils down to when you're working with other people. It's like I feel like that's one thing that's really easy to kind of gloss over in college, especially because you're working. You work by yourself or like those one or two people who you're like pretty good friends with, and you do all your projects with. Dan Miller, and like you guys kind of know how each other likes to do things. And if you're working by yourself, obviously it doesn't matter because you know how you like to do things. But like once you are working on like a real world project with one or two or four or five or 600 other developers. Like, I don't know. So
yeah,
someone's
got the you today is a totally different person essentially from the you a month from now. As far as I'm concerned, that's a different person. If I'm writing code that will last longer than a month, then it's going to be read by a version of me that has lost all insight into what I was doing at the time.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true.
And sometimes it happens over a weekend. You forgot what you were doing on Friday, and it's Monday.
Yeah. That's very true. And that's one of the things I appreciate most about Rails, kind of, is this consistency thing, or really any framework. So you take like any Rails website or any Laravel or Symfony website, and you put yourself in the root directory of that project, and you know where to look for things. If you have like a bug, you say, well, looks like this data's coming in wrong. Let me check at the model first. I know where the model is. Let me check the controller. I know how the controller actions map to URLs and parameters. That is incredibly valuable. Like, we had this discussion recently. As far as I'm concerned, if you're gonna say a company purchased another company, which may or may not have happened to me this week, and you're like, we're gonna like totally just integrate all their code into our code because it's PHP, and I'm like, no, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what language it's in. They're not using any of the libraries we use that, by the way, no one else uses with very rare exceptions. Like, no one else uses our ORM. No one else uses our controller-based, It would be just almost as hard as porting it from another language, because you have to rewrite anything anyways. Whereas, if you have a framework, it'd be way easier, because you take things for granted. Like, I know what their ORM is, probably. I know how their URL routing works, probably. I know how they render templates, probably. Or you know easily where to go to find the answer to those questions.
Yeah.
Anything else on consistency?
Yeah, I guess one other thing I think you guys were mentioning about the college level when you're learning, I'm kind of on the stance where if you get into bad habits, they're going to be a lot harder to break later on. So, I'm not going to say make sure every line you write is perfect as a college student, because you're still learning. Well, actually, you're always learning regardless of where you are. But I think the earlier you can fall into a consistent pattern, or, at least at our school, we kind of learned Java for the first year. If you can learn the Java core concepts first, that's going to set you up a lot better in the future. Because, like you said, a month from now, you're going to be a completely different developer. And so I think the earlier, the better. That's just my take on it.
Fair point. Yeah,
True
I think...
enough.
So, one thing that is interesting, though, like switching, even things that aren't bad habits, just are habits. It's like the way you format your code.
The people who come into work and use the style of braces where they're on the line below the function definition, not on the same one, they hate it.
Weird.
They hate the linter. They are just beyond incensed. Not because that's a bad style, just it's not their style.
Right.
Yeah, so that kind of happened to me when I started work this summer, because in Facebook JavaScript, if you're writing an anonymous function, they don't put a space between function and the parentheses, which is what Douglas Crockford likes to do and what I always did. So it took me like 2 or 3 weeks to break myself of that habit. Just like endless lint errors. There shouldn't be a space after the function keyword.
And you didn't write a Vim plugin to just do it for you? That gets dangerous really quickly, though.
Writing Vim plugins, yeah.
Because then you never actually change your habit.
Right.
And then it's that much more painful when you don't have your Vim.
Yeah, I guess I'm not that stubborn, but like...
So let's talk about naming conventions. The second hardest problem in computer science.
Yeah, I think it's definitely the hardest. Well, maybe second hardest, whatever you want to call it. But I think it could possibly be the easiest way to improve your code, like right now. I think one example I give in this is basically we use a single variable use a single letter variable name, just called x, and we compute some function that we compute some sum, or it just doesn't make any sense if you're reading it. But if the developer took the time to just change it and maybe use constants where there should be constants and better variable names, as you can see, you change that to hours worked rather than just using the variable name x, it becomes a hell of a lot more readable, and something that they don't need comments to figure it out what it is, and we'll get to comments down the line. Yeah. I think naming conventions are a huge thing.
So the code smell that I've been told that is when you see numbers, they're called magic numbers. Because if you see any integer or even a double or whatever, any number in your source code just flat out written there, you have no idea what that means. It's obvious to you writing it, but anyone else reading it, Y42. So you can just name that to a constant, put it a variable, and it's self-documenting, and it's really great. But that's another, as far as naming thing goes, it's not just variables, it's things that aren't in variables that should be in variables.
Right.
Even though they might not vary. But
I think constants are something I've grown to appreciate pretty recently, and especially for string or integer values that are used across many files or need to be referenced in other places. It makes your life so much easier to just have, say it's for a common event name, like the change event that happens everywhere. Just have a constant in a event names, module or something. It's it at first it seems like, ugh, I don't want to write out this stupid constant file that's just a static object. But then, the first time you have to go through, you need to change that string or that number, and you only have to change it in one place instead of 27. Feels a lot better.
One of my favorite uses of this that I saw is for HTTP status codes. So instead of saying, redirect 301, redirect 500, it's redirect move permanently. And you're like, oh, you don't have to open Google, HTTP status code 301, oh, it's moved permanently, and then this condition is for when it's not found. You just know it. You see it right there.
That's clutch.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. I know. Just to add on to the magic number thing, there was the first pull request that last summer I was interning at Microsoft. The first pull request the other guy next to me sent in for his project. The very first comment was about magic numbers, and they said there's only 3 numbers that you shouldn't have to add as constants or something, and that's 0, 1, and infinity. And I guess something to think about, but I think unless those have other meanings, I think maybe that's a pretty good rule to abide by.
Yeah. There's sometimes two when you're checking for evenness is
true.
A good example, but yeah. That we talked about is proper naming conventions falling under make your variable names as long as possible. No, that's number 6. But making your variable names and your method names as long as possible are kind of conjoined. I don't know. It always had. Well, I guess I empathize. For a while, I had this laziness too, but then I grew into making my function names and variable names as long as possible. It's gonna get compiled out anyways. Just write it in there. It'll be okay. It's not gonna affect anything significant at all ever. Any database call will eclipse the amount of time it takes for PHP to parse this.
Just use Mongo.
People don't do it. They use shorthand all the time. Data. And, the data variable is the number one thing.
Yeah.
And it's just awful.
Yeah.
Do any of you have any advice for how to break out of... Because I still find myself doing it. I wrote a data today, actually, and I looked at it, and I was like, no. It is data. It made sense in my head. I was like, yes, it's the data from the response. I'm just using an intermediary before I turn it into the thing I want. It's like, no. Data from the API call is a better variable name than data already. it could get even better, but that's a good start.
Yeah. So one thing I find, in general, I find I'm much better at naming like methods and functions than I am at naming variables, because variables tend to be like temporary and not really important to what's happening. So I just try and not write variables at all.
Interesting.
Like if I can do it if I can do something without variables, I feel so good. And so, I don't know, but I'm. Some people find that more confusing, but I personally do not.
No, I'm a big fan of so you end up with a more functional style where it's just a series of transformations on some initial piece of data.
Right. And so the thing that bugs me is that at work we tend to end up with these really big UI rendering functions where one chunk of the UI will be assigned to a variable at the very top of this, 300 line function, and then in the middle of that function, in an if statement, a class is added to that chunk of UI or something, and then it's rendered out later. And if you have to go through and track down why, oh, what the fuck? I don't know why.
Yeah, like that. You going through God, what the fuck is this?
Right, and all of a sudden it's broken. You have no idea why. That's so hard. When if instead of declaring this in this huge mess context of this giant rendering function, you just broke it out and rendered this one chunk of the UI in its own method. Again, every time. I'm trying to say something.
Just fine.
Right. So if all of the rendering for that specific method is contained in its own method, or for that specific, I'll say component, is contained in its own method, then life is way easier because you just write, this dot render my special component. And your if statement can be there, and all the everything you need to know about that chunk of your UI is contained in a method. So it's I guess you can I prefer to compose things rather than I don't know, never mind. That's not the right word. But the more I don't know, the more conditionals that you can factor out of the top level, the less confusing things become, I guess.
So you also mentioned here, Bob, that the name of the method should be as long as it needs to be, but then that the method should also only do one thing. So in a sense, they're long and short methods.
Yeah.
Name is long, the body of the method is short.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, as long. So the thing is, I took that, someone on Hacker News posted that as a comment to some item, and I kind of really liked it a lot. The point is that from a functional programming perspective, you're trying not to do a whole bunch of things, I feel like. If you can minimize state and whatnot, that's a good thing. So my point for point number 6 is basically, if you can have one method that pretty much does one thing, then you're golden. And by definition, if it's doing one thing, the method's probably going to be kind of small. So don't make it bigger than it needs to be, but don't make it do more than one thing, really, because I'd rather call two functions that do two separate things, two very clearly defined separate things, rather than call one method that does one thing and then realize down the line, wait, I need to refactor this, split it up into two methods, where else is this going to call, and then it just becomes a headache in the end.
Mm-hmm. Question, this is something I've run into a lot this week. How do you deal with methods that are short but are private to a class, and you want to use them outside? Because that's what I see people do a lot. They do this. They have a series of transformations that take place on a piece of data that gets passed into a class, but then there's just one public method and then a slew of private methods they call, which is great for them, I can't rationalize my feelings about this. Because I know if I were writing it, that's what I would do. I'd be like, hell yeah, private methods, they exist, I should use them. No one else should use this. But if they are stateless, then why not? That's my point. That's how I feel about it.
No, that's a good question. And I think to start off, you're right. Like, if I were writing it, I probably would have made everything private, or mostly everything private, and try to hide everything I could. I guess, obviously, context is a big deal, depending on what kind of method you're trying to reach for that's a private method. That I don't think I have a definitive answer to that. I think I would probably talk to the file owner, if I could, first of all, and see, is there something I should be worrying about that this private method is trying to encapsulate? Or is it something maybe we could refactor, maybe we can expose it in a different way?
Right. I think the OO solution is that then that thing should be its own object.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Single
responsibility principle.
There it is. There it is.
S in solid.
Yes. I don't know. How do you guys feel about that? Where do you normally lie when you write object-oriented code like that?
I've been doing the solid thing a lot. I did a big project early in the year where I was working on it with this person, and he was just unabashed, and he totally embraced my ideas about doing that. So I was like, all right. So I really went all out with this. And I think it worked out really well. I was really happy with what it ended up looking at in the end. You do a lot of typing. Your fingers get sore. But really, that's not that big of a problem. It made me feel good. It gave me something to do while I was thinking about what I was actually trying to do, instead of just staring at the screen. I was like, well, I'm going to type out this class header, and I'm going to type out this constructor, which is just mindless, and I'll assign it into some private state and go about it. But what you end up with is a highly reusable components. If you want to reuse the thing that parses out the headers from a specific API response in another class, you can very easily. Whereas if you just do that in the constructor, you just make the request and then assign it into some private variables, then that code is, kind of sucks. You also get the benefit of the D in solid at that point, which is dependency injection, because you don't necessarily get it. But I think if you want that, if you want the small objects that you can reuse, you have to use dependency injection, where all the things, you don't reference any class statically within that class. That's another code smell. You see any static references to a class name, a module, some global function, globals. Just my number one rule of programming is, when in doubt, just pass it in. Just make it a function parameter, better yet, a constructor parameter. Just pass it in. It makes testing way easier. It makes reusability way easier. That's where I am on it. Colby, you were about to say something before I launched off on that crusade.
To be honest, I don't remember what I was saying.
At least you're honest.
Yeah. However, now that you mentioned dependency injection, I don't like the dependency injection.
We might not be friends anymore.
So I think it solves a problem, which is testing your code.
No. It solves another problem.
You're right, but there are less unpleasant ways to solve that problem if you can solve the testing your code problem without dependency injection.
No, there aren't. The ways you solve testing your code without dependency injection is this horrific thing called mocks, which are just awful. Where you
see, I don't think they're awful.
You reprogram all the classes in forever to do something statically. You're like, well, this class receives this function call once with these parameters, and it returns this static thing. You could just pass that shit in instead of having to mock all of that out.
We have, at least in our JavaScript testing framework, we have it does auto mocking. So 95% of the time, it just returns this dumb class based on the class that you included. And like the functions, you can call the functions that are there, you can't call the functions that aren't there, and they return nothing, and they take any number of arguments. So it's it's basically like I've only ever had to write a mock like twice in my whole life, but it does all of this stupid work for you. Like, I don't know.
Here's a great example of a stupid. So I was doing this project. I had really small objects. And I didn't do dependency injection. I didn't do dependency injection on the global function we have that tells you what the path of the web directory is. And this became a giant pain in the ass because depending on where the test is running, that changes. And you can't assert on what it is anymore. So it's just easier to, outside of the function, say, pass in the deploy directory, call it outside, and you can set it whatever you want to in the test, and it's not going to change. You don't care what that is. That's clearly not what this module is about. This module isn't about fetching the current deploy directory. It's about formatting the stuff into the right like slashes. Like that's what we care about.
I suppose it's true. I don't know.
And
it just seems
PHP, mocking static functions is kind of like trying to do the hardest thing in the world. Like it's
right. Like I mean, PHP is a different. I don't want to think about that.
The answer is RunKit, and the end result is tears.
I don't know. I don't know what that means. I'll trust.
It's like Ruby monkey patching. Not fun.
Yeah, I mean that's effectively what you do in JavaScript, right? But it's less. It seems less scary because you can do anything in JavaScript.
Fair enough. So we should have a solid episode someday. That would be a fun wheelhouse. All right,
I agree.
Home stretch
already.
Number 7. Comments describe why, not how or what. What does that mean?
This is pretty much everyone that I've ever tutored who were very first or second year computer science students. Their comments pretty much meant nothing, and I said, "Why are the comments here?" And they said, "Oh, the professor says we need to have JavaDoc, or we need to have X amount of comments, or something like that." And you can understand the professor's intention is to get them into a good habit of writing comments and what they're for. But I feel like there's usually a gap, as you'll see anywhere, education versus real world, and it's just that the comments that the students were often writing were just kind of, they didn't make sense. So you had some sort of like conditional, like, oh, if X is less than 10, and then the comment would say, if X is less than 10. And it's like, yeah, that doesn't mean anything at all. You just rewrote the code twice, basically. So the idea here is that the code should say why you're doing something. Sorry, the comment should say why you're doing something, whereas the code will tell you pretty much what you're doing. Because if you're writing beautiful code that's using better variable names, you already know exactly what's going on. But maybe there's some sort of edge case and you don't know what you're testing for. And the comments should kind of come out there and really make that part shine.
I think we had a similar comment, no pun intended, on our first episode about version control, where your commit messages should be a why and not what your change is, which feels a lot like comments.
Yeah, I think you could. That's kind of an interesting stance. I don't think I've ever heard that one before. But what if what if you're working on a project, you're committing anytime something like good has happened? So maybe sometimes you want to explain exactly what you're doing, and maybe not. I don't know, man. That's a good way of putting it, though. Sometimes I just feel like I could say, like, I can make a commit message that explains exactly what I did, but maybe not. Maybe the intention isn't clear yet, and maybe if I just wrote like Lay's framework for future feature X, maybe that's not as clear as saying, oh, refactored, module XYZ. I don't know. I don't know. I think there's some variance in that.
Yeah, totally. I wrote a comment recently. I wish I could remember why, but I wrote in the comment why. Oh yes. Okay. So so here's a great example of when you should write a comment. I made a commit that took the escape function. So our mustache engine lets you define what the escape function does. And I set it to a lambda that takes an argument that is what is inside of the mustache and returns it out the other side unchanged. Long story short, we do input encoding at Etsy, not output encoding like everyone else in the world. So all the data in our database is already HTML encoded. So if we let Mustache do its thing, it would just HTML encode everything again that came straight from the database. So instead, I overrode the escape function to do nothing. And I had a giant comment block with to-do hacks written above it that explained exactly why I had done this, because it's totally surprising. The default behavior in Mustache is that the double brackets escape the variable that is put into it. And I am explicitly doing the exact opposite of that. But that was a 3-line change that is, you don't read it and exactly know why the escape function is this lambda that takes a variable and returns it out the other side. But with the comment, it's like, here's the reason why we had to do this. Here's the reason why, here are the alternatives, and this is why we went this way. The answer was because it was less work and we're lazy than changing everything to triple mustache or not doing input encoding, which would have been horrible.
Yeah, and the alternative to that, as I was saying, you would have written a comment that says, this lambda function returns exactly what's passed in, and then no one would know what the hell's going on.
Yeah, so that's obvious. It takes one parameter, and just the only body in the function is return x. I believe we even use the variable x because there's,
yeah, I mean,
it doesn't matter at that point what it is.
Because your code's already not beautiful after doing that. Just kidding.
Sometimes true. You can write ugly code in any programming language.
Absolutely. Some languages make it easier to do that.
JavaScript.
C++, let's be real.
Yeah.
C++ can be very ugly. False. Yes. Gotta love that. Yeah, I think the only other thing I have to say about comments is basically kind of like Javadoc style things. When you have those sorts of things that are supposed to make your documents about your functions and stuff.
What are Javadocs?
What's the name for those? I'm trying to.
That is the name of them. I'm just
I'm thinking of the larger category though. Like C# has their own thing. Doc blocks, whatever you want to call them. So basically, the comments that describe classes and functions and sometimes constants and stuff. The point is, if you're in there just saying like, oh, this function returns X, and the function name is called returns X or something, like that is once again repetitive. And if you were to ever refactor that, now you have to refactor your comments to be severely different.
That was the next question was going to be. How do you deal with that? How do you make sure your comments reflect the current state of your code? It's especially easy when you have those doc blocks at the top of a function and the place you were editing in, it doesn't fit on that screen, so you didn't even realize the doc block was there. And meanwhile, you changed the return value or whatever.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's obviously up to the maintainer or the developer, whoever's changing it, to update those doc blocks. But I think if your function is adhering to these kind of rules that I kind of laid out and that they're doing one thing, then more likely your doc blocks won't be changing all that much. Maybe you're adding a parameter, but generally, unless you're doing a huge refactor of your code base, you're probably not going to change the return type. You're probably not going to change the signature, or you're not going to change the name of the function, because if you are changing the name of the function, you're probably making a new one. Unless you're deprecating it, in that case, kind of all holds are off. So I think the best way to go about that is just to not make these methods or whatever big enough. Not to make them big in the very beginning, so that your maintenance costs are a lot lower in the future. And that's really the whole point of Beautiful Code, is lower maintenance.
One of my favorite solutions to this is the Elixir Python solution, which is you can put code in your documents that your test suite executes. And so you write kind of like the stupidest possible use of the function. It takes hello and world and returns the two concatenated. And you type the code that does that, and then you put the return value below it. And then that just gets run. So if you ever change the function, then your comments break. which is kind of interesting.
That is cool. Wow.
Interesting.
I'm also a big fan. Someone released a Ruby gem a couple months ago that it looks at Git when you add a to-do line, and it auto expires the to-dos, and your test starts failing when the to-do still exists like a month later.
That's really nice, actually.
I just looked at a piece of code yesterday that was last modified in 2012. You know this person, actually, Colby. And at the very top it read, "This is just a temporary place for this. We'll move it out in 2 weeks." Over 2 years later.
Nice.
It's still there.
I think that Ruby gem should have been featured in your Getting Stuff Done episode, because that feels like a really nice way to get a kick in the butt to do your work, you know?
And at that point I would make to-dos all over the place because I know that they come back to me.
Yeah.
And it's so convenient. Like, you're already in you don't have to like open up your to-do list or OmniFocus or Jira or whatever. It's already there. Just go. Yeah. It would be really cool.
I like it.
To-dos can be a blessing and a curse, though, sometimes. Sometimes you have a to-do, don't touch this, it'll break. And then sometimes you have those to-dos that are like, yeah, it'll be gone in 2 weeks, just like you said. And 2 years later, they're still there. But it works, right? No.
Yeah.
Not beautiful.
I like when you find a to-do from like 3 years previous that's like, don't touch this, it'll break. But like, you need to touch it, and the guy and everyone he worked with no longer works at the company. So it's like,
Did you guys see that Stack Overflow or maybe a Stack Exchange post about the best comments they ever saw in source code?
I think I've read it before, yeah.
I just recently stumbled upon it again because I remember reading it before, but I think the best one was some block comment, and it was like, don't touch this, it's magic, like, anyone who's going to do it is going to refactor it and then realize everything doesn't work anyway. So here's a counter that you can increase of the number of hours wasted on this piece of code. So when you're done, it's a warning to the future person. So it's like hours wasted was like 2 hours. I think that's probably the best comment, actually, you could have.
I like that.
One of my favorite ones I saw just recently that I tweeted was catch exception E, and then the body of the catch was just the comment cry and catch. So I have a thing that I've started to realize about myself when I'm judging code, very judgmental about code, is there's something about the shape of it. You can look like, you full screen your editor, you like back off on the font size a little bit, you can see without reading any of it if it's beautiful code or not in a way. Does anyone else agree with me on that?
Absolutely.
It's like a beautiful class is kind of uniform and stilted. It's just like boom, 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 boom. An ugly thing like waves around a little bit, like especially if it's wavy and not just like a bump. A bump is maybe okay, but wavy is really bad.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Wavy means that there's like a conditional that you can't fit on your screen, which means you're gonna break something every time you change it, and no one will know.
Yeah, we haven't even talked about the classic 80 character line length. I mean,
that's one I didn't even touch in my presentation because I didn't want to get into it. But let's get into that.
So this is actually at Facebook. There are several topics of conversation that are commonly referred to as great debates because everyone has very strong opinions about them. And one of them is our enforced 80 character line limit on everything.
Enforced, huh?
Yes. You can't. Well, I mean, it's like linter enforced. So like you can, if it fails when you commit, you can like provide an explanation as why you were too cool for the 80 character line limit stuff. But yeah, that's interesting. So that is one thing I find myself like trying to make my method name shorter. Is when my method, like the name of my class,
names are rarely going to be 80 characters long, though, and you can always put the parameters on their own lines.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, usually no, you go.
I was just gonna say, like, I mean, you can certainly format your code differently. However, so one of the things that I find is ill-defined is like how you break up various control structures onto multiple lines when they exceed the 80 character limit. Like how do you break up your if statement?
You don't have a style guide for that?
For some things we do, but it does not cover the more intense edge cases I've found.
I would be really interested in seeing what defines an intense control structure for you, Colby.
Did I say intense?
You did.
I didn't realize that. If statements are intense.
They can be. I was going to say that if I just run over the 80 character limit, I just stop indenting. I just put everything back into. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think it's a good debate though to have about the 80 character versus what are some other conventions. I've heard 120. I've heard 123 characters. They all have some weird historical basis behind them. I think though, as Colby,
3 characters where every line is a tweet.
140 characters. I bet Twitter does that. I bet Twitter does that. Yeah, I don't know. I think having a guide like that, or some sort of like Colby was saying, a linter for 80 characters, or whatever you set it to be, is definitely a good idea. But at the same coin, if you are doing proper naming conventions and you're not making this method that takes in 15 parameters or whatever, I think it flows better in general. All these pieces start to come together when you start, adhering to more standard rules.
Yeah, I have another thought experiment that I learned just today, actually.
Oh boy!
Whoa.
Smalltalk, my favorite programming language that I've barely used. I learned today, in its first iteration. So Smalltalk, we might have said this before on the show. Smalltalk isn't just a programming language; it's a whole environment. It's like Lisp. It's the entire computer is Smalltalk. The Smalltalk environment, the first version of it, had no monospaced fonts. Everything was proportional. And the story I heard today was that led to code being written entirely differently. You felt much more comfortable when your font was more cursive to be like effusive with your variable names and your comments and your method names. Colby.
What does effusive mean?
Saying lots of words to describe something.
Okay.
I don't know if that's actually what it means.
I believe you.
The actual definition is expressing feelings of gratitude, pleasure, or approval in an unrestrained or heartfelt manner. Or in geology, poured out when molten and later solidified. Neither of those really match what I was trying to say. So good call. Thank you for calling me out on that.
I didn't mean to make you look like a fool. I just didn't know what you were saying. I figured there might be some listeners.
It caused people to put more words on their source code.
Okay.
They eventually reversed that decision, but I thought that was an interesting design choice. And I would be interested in trying to write some code with so just so everyone knows, monospaced fonts are where every character takes up the same width and probably width and height pixels. And proportionally spaced fonts are when every character takes up a different space, which is more natural to how you would actually handwrite something.
Right. So examples are Helvetica is a proportionally spaced font, whereas Courier New is a monospaced font. I'm trying to think of the Microsoft Word fonts, or the fonts you'd see in your.
I just assumed that most fonts that you'd use in Microsoft Word were proportionally spaced.
Most of them are, yeah, but actually, I feel like monospaced fonts. A lot of them look like typewriter fonts. That's what it makes me think.
That's the perfect way to put it. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I like that. Okay. Any other thoughts on that? Okay. It's crazy. My other thing, I found a Twitter thread of what people thought beautiful code was. I did my homework before I came on the show.
Oh snap!
And one that I thought was interesting, again, these are 140 characters, so you can only do so much, but one that was interesting was, so, the prompt was, what is beautiful code? And the person, Steve Klabnik, actually answered, clear narrative structure, which kind of goes beyond just the line and into the overall story that's being told, so to speak.
That's bold. I will say I do not put that much thought into my classes. I just ABC order all my functions, and then I feel like that's enough.
That's okay. I think alphabetically naming your function definitions, but it's kind of like the inside. Does the inside tell a story of what this thing does, or is it not communicative?
I agree. So that's the thing. That's the thing I feel like you get if you never write variables and go with methods and functions. A clear it's declarative. Yes. It's this is what happens.
Yeah, I think reading a class from top to bottom necessarily doesn't need to make sense in order, as if it were a novel. But as we were talking about, the shape of classes, you can almost visually see right away that this class is going to make a lot of sense, or is this just going to be a jumble or kind of a glue class that puts a bunch of crap together and doesn't make any sense.
Yes, I understand.
And the last question before we run out of time is, should we spend all of our time making beautiful code in every situation? Are there exceptions to this rule? Or all these 7 rules that we've discussed?
For the sake of argument, I'm going to go ahead and say no. You should always be following these rules, and that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, is that old habits you have die a lot harder. If you get into these habits now, you'll be better off in the future. And once again, I'm not saying these 7 rules are perfect and they're a Bible, because every language or whatever you're going to be writing in is going to be different. But I think that they're general enough that every single programming language or any software project you work on with people, I think you can apply these rules right away.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those things sometimes, you're trying to get something done super fast and you don't you feel like taking the extra 2 hours to make this perfect right now isn't worth it right now. But you'll totally come back to it next week after this thing is out and refactor it. And you'll almost never do that.
Exactly.
And no one else will do it either.
What about
I've made deals with people on code reviews and stuff I'm willing to allow this right now as long as next week you leave yourself a task and fix it, but they never do. And I never make them because I almost immediately forget about it.
What about the situation where you're, as we almost always are, modifying a file that already exists and it doesn't follow these conventions? Is it better to start the grassroots movement of following these conventions, or is it better to stick to the local environment?
That's a touchy subject, because you could be really getting down the rabbit hole as you figure out how far down this goes. If it were a function, maybe you can rewrite that or refactor it, I should say. And that's fine. And maybe that'll spark someone else who goes in the file next and say, hey, this looks beautiful. Let me do this one. But yeah, that's really, really sensitive and very dependent.
Yeah, it's also very dependent on that next person having the same sensibilities for this sort of thing as you do.
Yeah.
Which is often not the case. Often they have a third very different sensibility, so they write in their third different way of doing things.
And that's why style guides are important.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Indeed.
It's the classic XKCD where we have 2 standards. We need to make a 3rd standard that's better than these other 2. We have 3 standards.
Yep.
Cool. Any other comments on beautiful code?
Did we finish the presentation?
I think so.
Yeah,
we did.
We can recap the 7 points quickly.
Go for it.
They're essentially: 1, clean code matters a lot more than you would think. Number 2 is code is read more often than it's written, so make it pretty. Number 3 is to know the paradigms of your language. Number 4 is that consistency is key. Number 5 is to use proper naming conventions. Number 6 is to make methods as big as they need to be. And 7 is comments describe why and not how or what. Awesome.
Thank you both for being with us. Bob, do you have anything you want to plug? Any cool things you're working on or Twitter handles, whatnot?
No, just check out my Twitter handle, @BobNisco. I actually just recently wrote a Spotify, some sort of weird, cool web app that helps you discover music in AngularJS, which was fun. But otherwise, I don't have anything cool.
How do I get that?
Spotlister, like SPOTLISTR, no E because I'm edgy, .herokuapp.com.
Very edgy.
Very edgy.
Nice. I'm signing up.
All right, yeah. Otherwise, no, it's been great. Thank you guys for having me. It was a lot of fun.
And Colby is at Colby Rabideau on the Twitterverse. I'm at Jazzdan on the Twitterverse. And just to tell you, Bob, you might be interested in this. Colby and I are going to do part 2 of, what are we calling this series?
The Change Mode Challenge.
The Change Mode Challenge. Part 2 of the Change Mode Challenge, where we are, I think, going to write a to-do list in Swift and Cocoa, right?
I think that was our plan. I still haven't gotten a developer account yet, but
I did, and I installed it, and I ran it, and I made a view with a list in it, but I couldn't figure out how to do anything else. So
yes, all right. I feel like I can do all that stuff in like a day.
Yeah. Spoiler alert: it just involved dragging a box onto a screen and then staring at my code and having no idea what to do after that. So that'll be a lot of fun. 2 weeks from now, so 2 Wednesdays from now, where does that put us? Somewhere in July. Second week of July, I think. Definitely check it out. We'll post it on all the normal places so you don't miss it. Thanks again for listening to Change Mode. This has been episode 5, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for the Swift Change Mode Challenge. Thanks, everyone.
Woo-hoo.
This show is brewed fresh weekly by the Coffee and Beer Podcast Network. Get all our shows at our website, coffeeandbeer.tv.